I hope everybody's having a good time in Massachusetts. We aim to do that for you, facilitate that anyway. And, we get a real good group of in the host committee, both men and women, and they've worked really hard on this. So. You can tell I'm stalling because we're last. So the Salem Zouaves should be
very well. Why don't I brag about the Lindsay alcohol?
His next tradition, the chairman of the host committee.
For those of you who weren't able to go with us on a very hot bus, and I mean it was hot, but it was well worth the trip when we got there. We landed in Lynn. It took us about an hour and 20 minutes to get there. We all arrived and we went right upstairs to the Masonic Hall, where we were treated to a fantastic roast pork dinner, baked potatoes, string beans, and we topped it all off with ice cream and strawberries. After that, no one wanted to go to the hall. They all wanted to sit there and rest and then maybe go back on the hot bus and go back home. Because we were all full, only I didn't get to eat, so I couldn't really attest to it. But I've had that dinner many times, and it's a great, great dinner. So we had a super time. When we got to the hall, I got to do a little bragging, because this hall is, and I think those that were there yesterday and have seen this would agree with me on this. There's not another one like it in the country. And what makes it so distinctive is that when you go to the main hall, which has original rugs, original furniture, and on the walls is 1,243 pictures of veterans who were members of that post. And when you stand there and you're looking up at these, as an example, there's one person who is in one picture that's up there. The gentleman is in his casket. He died before they could get the picture taken, and so they went and took his picture in the casket so they could have him on the wall. Now, you can't see that when you're looking up on the wall, because you just see his face. But on the glass negative that we have, it shows the undertaker standing next to him, holding him a little bit to make sure he didn't, was properly so they could take the picture. With that and all of the other things that we have at that hall, it's it's unbelievable. I say this in the fact that in I think it was around 1887, 88, the General Lee One out of Richmond, Virginia, came north and visited the Lynn GAR, which was, they were returning a visit that the Lynn GAR men had gone down to visit them. And the women of that group, their auxiliary, came up and presented to the Women's Auxiliary of Camp 5, they presented this flag. And if you look at it, it's kind of, you can see that it's been through a little bit through the ringer. But you can also see it's very old, and we've got it finally closed up inside of a, sealed in a glass case. It was one of the last flags to fly in Richmond before Grant took it. I can tell you the number of people that when they see that, they want to own it, especially if they're guys that like to collect flags. It's really a fantastic picture. So that's just one thing. We have a little note card. Are we ready? So I can stop. All right. You can't hear anymore. You got to come to Lynn and see it. And if you want to come, let me know, and I'll make sure the place is open and that you can have the greatest tour that you'll ever run. I just got to finish one thing. Our city council president known about the place, that it was there for years. And I happened to be there one day when he came in for a quick tour. He wanted some friend of his to see that this was a great place. And after he left, he's now formed a committee to help raise the $8 million that we need to bring this hall up to museum standards today. $2.5 million to make it ADA compliant, and another $6 million to finish it off with bringing it up so that we have proper air handling and everything like that. When we advertise this as being an original, it is an original all the way through. Okay, I'll get out of the way. There you go.
You can tell that, you can tell Dexter's not very passionate about the LNJRO. All right, it's my pleasure to introduce the Salem Zouaves.
Slide over a little. Attention, squad. Right, dress. Front, present, arms. 1, 2, shoulder, arms. 1, 2, right shoulder shift, arms. 1, 2, shoulder, arms. 1, 2, left shoulder shift, arms. 1, 2, 3, shoulder, arms. 1, 2, 3, support, arms. 1, 2, 3, right shoulder shift, arms. 1, 2, 3, shoulder, arms. 1, 2, fix, bayonet. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, shoulder, arms. 1, 2, 3, charge, bayonet. 1, 2, shoulder, arms. 1, 2, guard against infantry, guard. 1, 2, shoulder, arms. 1, 2, guard against cavalry, guard. 1, 2, shoulder, arms. 1, 2, into ranks, form company, left, face. 1, march. Left, dress. Front, charge, bayonet. 1, 2, shoulder, arms. 1, 2, guard against infantry, guard. 1, 2, shoulder, arms. 1, 2, guard against cavalry, guard. 1, 2, shoulder, arms. 1, 2, order, arms. 1, 2, stack, arms. Parade, rest. 1, 2.
Yeah, I'm just going to use the microphone. Is this on?
Yes.
Good. Just make sure everybody can hear me. So a little introduction. We are the Salem Light Infantry, Company J of the 8th Massachusetts Volunteer Militia, sometimes called the Salem Zouaves. This may be, some of this information people may already know about, but in 1830, the French invaded Algeria, and they recruited native Algerian troops into the French army, and they allowed them to retain their distinctive Turkish uniforms. And the uniforms became so popular in the French army that eventually native Frenchmen pushed the Algerians out of the Zouave regiments, and they were filled up with veteran French troops, and they actually had to start new Algerian regiments for the actual Algerians. They came to international notice during the Crimean War. The French Zouaves were extreme veterans. You had to be a veteran soldier in order to belong to a Zouave regiment. And they prided themselves on being extremely aggressive, especially a preference for cold steel in battle. And during one of the actions in the Crimea, a Zouave regiment ran 4 miles with full packs, climbed a 200-foot cliff, and stormed a redoubt at the point of the bayonet. So this was front page news in Europe. But it probably would have gone unnoticed in the United States if it hadn't been for a gentleman named Elmer Ellsworth. Elmer Ellsworth was a young, out-of-work young man from upstate New York. And he did what a lot of people did in the 1850s, young unemployed men. He went west, he went to the frontier. Now, in the early 1850s, the frontier was Chicago. So he ends up in Chicago, starving actually. Starts a couple of businesses, the businesses fail, he loses all his money he's invested in the businesses. But he runs into a down and out militia company. And he's a natural drill master. He's also an extremely charismatic person, and he gets elected the captain of this company of militia in the Illinois National Guard. But he's also been taking fencing lessons from a gentleman who had been a surgeon in a Zouave regiment in the French army during the Crimean War. And this surgeon fills his head with stories of the daring do of the Zouaves in Crimea. And Elmer Ellsworth is a natural drill master, and he decides that he wants to change his Illinois National Guard company into a Zouave company. So he gets a pledge from all the men in the company. They agree to a code of behavior. So, for example, they don't wear their uniforms except in formal occasions. They never wear uniforms to dances. They're never seen drinking in public. There's a whole code of behavior. But the main thing is that they agree to drill 3 hours a day, 6 days a week. And you have to understand that in the 1850s, people worked 10-hour days, 6 days a week. So these people would meet at their armory in Chicago at 7 o'clock at night after having worked for 10 hours, and they would drill till 11 o'clock at night every day except Sunday. And they became the best drill militia company in the United States. Now, the problem Elmer Ellsworth had was that except for this surgeon, he had never actually seen a real French Zouave. The person who told him stories had been a Zouave, but Elmer Ellsworth hadn't seen any other actual Zouaves. So he invented a drill routine, which he called the Zouave drill, and he invented uniforms which were loosely based on the French uniforms. The French uniforms were Turkish uniforms. The French Zouaves wore fezzes and turbans and had little genie jackets like these, and they had big baggy pants that actually don't have separate legs. They're a square bag of cloth with 2 holes at the bottom for your legs to go through. But Elmer Ellsworth invented his own Zouave uniform. And Elmer Ellsworth's U.S. Zouave Cadets, as they renamed themselves, were the best drilled militia company in the United States. And we know they were the best drilled militia company in the United States because in the summer of 1860 they went on a tour of the northeastern part of the United States, challenging all the militia companies to a drill competition. So this was a common form of entertainment back then. Every town had a militia company, and they used to have drill competitions. They'd get together and do their manual of arms and things, and then they'd get voted on who was going to win the prize. And Elmer Ellsworth challenged anybody and everybody to a drill competition. And he was undefeated. They went all across the Northeast. They were the talk of the town. There were sort of 2 big public events going on in the summer of 1860. The Prince of Wales was doing a anonymous, incognito, well, everybody knew who he was, but he was doing it under a false name. He did a tour of the United States, and everybody wanted to meet the Prince of Wales, and everybody wanted to see Elmer Ellsworth and the U.S. Zouave Cadets do their drill demonstration. Now, the drill demonstration that they did was 3.5 hours long. It included 3 changes of uniform. They not only had a Zouave uniform, they had a dress uniform, and they had a field uniform. But the drill that they did was pretty much wholly invented by Elmer Ellsworth, the manual of arms he did. So we just did a little bit of it, and the reason we did it as a unit from Massachusetts, Company J of the 8th Massachusetts Volunteer Militia, is that in one of the failed businesses that Elmer Ellsworth was involved in, he was involved with a gentleman from Salem, Massachusetts, named Arthur Forrester Devereux. And Arthur Forrester Devereux tried making his fortune on the, he was actually from Salem, Massachusetts. He tried making his fortune on the western frontier and failed miserably, and returned to Salem, Massachusetts, and joined the Salem Light Infantry and was elected captain of the Salem Light Infantry, which was an old militia company that had been around since before the War of 1812. And they wore typical War of 1812 style uniforms. They had high tight collars and white cross belts and tight pants and helmets with horsehair plumes and things like that. And in the summer of 1860, when the U.S. Zouave cadets were on tour, they came to Boston and did a drill demonstration at Doric Hall. And Arthur Forrester Devereux took the train down from Salem to see this drill demonstration. And after the demonstration was over, he went backstage to say hi to his buddy Elmer. And Elmer Ellsworth said, so I understand that you're a captain of a militia company in Massachusetts. Would you like us to come to Salem and do a drill demonstration for him? And he said, great. So the U.S. Zouave cadets got on the train, went to Salem, spent the night in the armory, the Salem Light Infantry Armory, which no longer exists, unfortunately. And the next day they did a drill demonstration. Then they got back on the train and they continued their tour of the Northeast. But the men in the Salem Light Infantry went to their captain, Devereux, and they said, we want to be like those guys. And we know that you know how to do that. You were out there with the Illinois National Guard, you know this drill. And Arthur Forrester Devereux said, okay, here's the deal. There's a contract you have to sign. And there's all these rules about not wearing your uniforms to public balls and not drinking in public. And the little bit about drilling 3 hours a day, 6 days a week. So the men signed up for this, and they became the best drilled militia company in Massachusetts. And so what we just did was a little bit of Elmer Ellsworth's Manual of Arms. This is completely different from the Manual of Arms that people were doing during the Civil War. This is not like the standard Union or Confederate Manual of Arms. It was a special show Manual of Arms developed by Elmer Ellsworth specifically for militia drill competitions. So it's deliberately flashy. But one thing that he didn't invent was the bayonet drill. We're going to do a little bit of bayonet drill for you. This was very popular with Zouave regiments in the French army to do this bayonet drill, and it spilled over to the United States during the American Civil War. The bayonet drill we're going to do was actually a translation of a French manual written by a Frenchman named Gomard that was done by George McClellan. In the early 1850s, George McClellan was a second lieutenant in the engineers stationed at West Point. West Point was run by the engineers, and there were two companies of engineers stationed at West Point. He was a second lieutenant. He had graduated from the military academy. Now, promotion back then was glacially slow. The only way you got promoted was by seniority. So somebody above you had to retire or die in order for you to get a promotion. And he was an extremely ambitious man, so he petitioned the War Department continuously for little projects to get some attention. And finally, I think it was 1852, now I'm getting a little, 1852, he got permission from the War Department to translate a French bayonet fencing manual for the use of the United States Army. A lot of people don't realize that all the drill manuals that were used by the armies on both sides during the Civil War were actually translations of French manuals. The French had the largest army in the world at that point in time. Everybody was imitating them. The United States Army and the Confederate Army deliberately imitated them. So when you hear things like Casey's tactics or some of the other names that are associated with tactics manuals, Hardy's tactics and things like that, Hardy didn't write the tactics manual. Casey didn't write the tactics manual. What they did was they headed commissions which translated French manuals and adapted them for U.S. service. So we're going to show you a little bit of the one that McClellan translated. McClellan had a natural gift for language, which is how he got picked for this job. And it allowed him to go home to Philadelphia while he was working on the translation. So he got to spend a couple months at home and produced a bayonet manual. So we're going to show you a little bit of that drill because the U.S. Zouave cadets used McClellan's bayonet fencing system for their bayonet drill. Attention, squad. Take arms. Shoulder, arms. 1, 2. As skirmishers by the right, left flanks, take intervals, double quick, march. Guard. 1, 2. Salute. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. Thrust.
develop, guard, advance, retreat, leap to the rear, with the passade, lunge, guard, lunge out, retreat, in prime parry, in second parry, guard, in terce parry, in quart parry, in terce sixth parry, guard, lower the stock, strike, guard, left, vault, stock to the right, strike, develop, guard, right, vault, stock to the rear, strike, develop, guard, in high terce parry, in high cart parry, guard, in second, in retreat, parry, on the right, short, thrust, guard, in terce, in retreat, parry, on the left, short, thrust, develop, guard, check your locking rings, coup de melee, arm, 1, 2, 3, shoulder, arm, 1, 2, assemble in the center, double quick, march, left, dress, front, unfix, bayonet, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, shoulder, arms, 1, 2, 3, prepare to break ranks, right, face, 1, arms, port, 1, break ranks, march. Now, we don't actually drill 3 hours a day, 6 days a week. We drill once a week, though. Any questions? Yes?
How long did it take you to learn all that?
A couple of years. We didn't have the advantage of having a experienced drill master who did this. You know, to the best of our knowledge, nobody was doing Elmer Ellsworth's drill. And there's actually an interesting problem with Elmer Ellsworth's drill, which is Elmer Ellsworth was a big celebrity. I assume most of you know who Elmer Ellsworth was. You know, he was the first officer killed in the Civil War. He was a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln's. And that's from him practicing law out in Springfield, Illinois, when he was living out in Chicago. He was such a celebrity after his death that people published Zouave manuals with his name on the cover, not claiming that he wrote them, just throwing his name and his picture on the cover. So there's all these different manuals which are not Elmer Ellsworth's drill that were being sold to people as Elmer Ellsworth's manuals. So, but there is a surviving Elmer Ellsworth manual, and we had to go through and interpret. Boy, I'm hard pressed to pick one. There's several actions where they were involved. There were a lot of Zouave regiments off and on during the war. The militia company, we're actually a militia company, not a volunteer company. The militia companies only served for 90 days. So the Salem Zouaves only served from April 1861 to the end of July 1861. They never saw action. They were stationed in Maryland guarding a railroad viaduct. The viaduct still stands, by the way. It goes across the Patapsco River. I don't know who's from Maryland, but yeah, it goes across the Patapsco River. It was built in the 1830s. It's a big curved stone viaduct. They were scared to death that somebody was going to sabotage it. They put 4 regiments of infantry and 2 batteries of artillery to guard this thing. So they spent 90 days staring at a railroad viaduct. Never fought, but yes.
You talk about your uniforms and how you developed those?
Oh yes, we were extremely lucky. We were actually people who got who met each other through our interest in historical fencing, and we have been involved in medieval fencing and Renaissance fencing and 19th century fencing, and we got interested in bayonet fencing, and of course that led us to study Zouaves because the Zouaves were so famous for their bayonet fencing. And we decided after a while that we actually wanted to reenact a unit that did bayonet fencing. And so we put the word out to our friends, and we ran into a gentleman who teaches at Gordon College. And he said, the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem has a complete Zouave uniform from a unit in Salem.
So we went down to the Peabody Essex and we looked at this uniform, and there was a gentleman who had served with the Salem Zouaves for their 90 days. Once the 90 days was up, he enlisted in the 19th Massachusetts, and he was killed at the Battle of Antietam. But he had left his uniform with his parents in Salem. And at the turn of the century, they donated it to the Peabody Essex Museum. And it's a complete uniform. It has the pants, the vest, the sash, the jacket, the leggings, the canteen, the pack, the belt, everything, the hat. And so they generously allowed us to measure and reproduce them. So we have to make these uniforms ourselves. Nobody's making these uniforms. But they're copied from an original, a complete original in the collection of the Peabody Essex Museum. But once again, they're copies of Elmer Ellsworth's copies of the French. So the people who, they were designed by a tailor in Baltimore in the summer of 1861. So he may never have actually seen a real Zouave. Other questions? Yes?
What was the mortality rate of the Zouave?
I have no idea.
They had a red uniform that was right.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting thing. When people are standing shoulder to shoulder, blasting away into clouds of black powder smoke, the color of your uniform doesn't really make much difference on whether you're hit or not. There's a mistaken belief, in my opinion, that Zouaves only existed at the beginning of the Civil War, and there's no doubt that there were a lot of colorful militia uniforms at the beginning of the Civil War, and most of them went away. But most of them went away for logistics reasons, not because they were too easy to see on the battlefield. And there were about 140 regiments that wore Zouave uniforms during the Civil War, and at the end at Appomattox, there was an entire brigade of Zouaves at Appomattox Courthouse. What you're trading off is the uniforms are expensive. These men bought their own uniforms. They hired a tailor in Baltimore to design the uniform for them. They took up a collection and they paid for the uniforms themselves. If they had taken federal issue, well, actually at that point they're militia. They would have taken state issue, Massachusetts issue uniforms. Then they wouldn't have had to pay for them. But they liked the uniforms so much that they decided they were willing to pay for them. And that's sort of the same thing for a lot of units during the Civil War. Pennsylvania, for example, had an official Zouave uniform. There was a Pennsylvania issue Zouave uniform that they issued throughout the war. Yes?
How effective did they consider the regiment's bayonet?
It varied widely. There's an interesting article written by an officer named Wilcox. He's in the 10th Cavalry in the 1880s. There's a professional journal, the United Service Journal, and it's a professional journal with articles written by professional officers. And he writes an article about the Surgeon General's report from the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, the Surgeon General compiled statistics on wounds. Every time somebody was treated, you were supposed to keep track of what they were treated for. And he compiled statistics which indicated that something like only 1 in 149 wounds were bayonet wounds. And so there was a big outcry about the wasted effort in providing bayonets for, they said most soldiers use their bayonets as entrenching tools. We can make a better entrenching tool. And nobody actually sticks anybody with the bayonet, so what's the point? And Wilcox challenged that. He said that the problem with the bayonet was that the interpretation of the Surgeon General's report was mistaken in that it only recorded instances where people knew that the bayonet had been the weapon. So he said that if you actually look at the Surgeon General's statistics and you include all incised, contused, and I'm trying to remember, penetrating wounds, it becomes 1 in 10. So so all of a sudden it goes from 1 in 149 to 1 in 10. Now you can't tell if somebody's got a hole in them for sure whether it was made by a bayonet, whether it was made by a shovel, whether it was made by a pointy stick, something like that. But his argument was that that knowing how to fence with a bayonet would protect you against being cut with a sword, stabbed with an entrenching tool, hit over the head with a rock, et cetera, et cetera. So that was something that the professionals debated all through the 19th century, is the effectiveness of actual bayonets and use in combat. Yeah. Yes?
What's a good reference book on overall Zouave history?
I'm spacing on the author's name, which is no help whatsoever. There is a book on Zouaves, a rather good one that sort of catalogs all the different units and has as many photographs as they were able to accumulate. You know, most of the units you can at least find one photograph of a member of the unit, but I can't remember the author's
Is that
name.
the first and the finest?
Yes.
Like Campfire or something like that?
Yeah, it's something like that.
Yeah, the title is The First and the Finest. I can't think of the author's name either. Big something.
We had time?
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Finish up, please.
We're done. Thank you very much.
All right, there'll be a quiz on all the French stuff. As you can tell, Paul Kenworthy is, as we say in these parts, wicked smart. He's a camp commander of the, as I said, the FW Lander Camp, number 5 in Lynn.